Hello everyone. This is a video which is a continuation of the previous video. In the last video I have discussed about the Government of India Act 1919, right? So we looked into all the different nuances of that. And for those who are completely new to this video, if you're going to be watching this video for the first time, to know why is this video even made, you need to actually go have a look at the previous video, because both these sessions, the last one as well as the present session, it's an answer to a question as to why are the questions in prelims on the Government of India Act 1919 and 35 so difficult to handle. The reason is because the way you learn the provisions of 1919 and 1935 Act, it's confined to what is there in Lakshmikant and Spectrum, right? And though the chapters, the name of the chapter is historical background, there is actually no history at all in that. So what happens is, as an aspirant, you start simply mugging up. You start simply just hoping that repeated exposures to the provisions, you will be able to remember it on the day of the exam, right? So it's to actually solve that problem. It's to make sure you have another interesting way of learning the provisions of 1919 and 1935 Act. That's the reason why these two videos have even been recorded. Alright, so the present session also caters to the same purpose. It's 40-45 minutes long video, and by watching this you will be able to actually relate to all the reasons as to why there are different provisions in Government of India Act 1935, right? So every single provision of Government of India Act 1935 actually has a history behind that. If you only know the history behind that, you wouldn't actually be able to forget these provisions. But the absence of history when you read Lakshmikant is what makes it difficult. So let's start addressing that. Okay, so for those who are watching this video for the first time, I would share a quiz of 5 questions, right? That will be found in the description box and in the comment section. I'll share a link of those 5 questions. It's time you try out those 5 questions. See where you stand with respect to those 5 questions. Are you able to get those 5 questions right or wrong? You know, that's the litmus test of the effectiveness of what you have read. If you're able to get those 5 questions right, it means that you don't even have to watch the remaining 40-45 minutes of this session as well as the previous session. But if you're not able to get them right, it's better you watch. Could be of some help on the day of your examination. Alright, so now let's start our discussion of Government of India Act 1935. So I'm not going to simply list out all the different provisions, but first let me give you all the different forces of history which has shaped the provisions of the 1935 Act, right? There are many aspects of history going all the way back to Government of India Act 1919. So many shortcomings of Government of India Act 1919 will be set right in the Government of India Act 1935. So you need to know what that is. And not only that, after Government of India Act 1919, there broke out a pan-Indian movement which is called as the non-cooperation movement. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And during the course of non-cooperation movement, you will find that princely states have greatly assisted the Britishers in suppressing the non-cooperation movement. So whenever the Congress leaders, whenever the agitationists were hiding in the princely states had greatly cooperated, right? And they did have their own reward as well. Okay, and not only that, the princely states have also had a lot of contribution towards the First World War. They were the hotbeds of recruitment, right? Many of the princely states are in Rajasthan, so that's where even today Rajasthan remains a very important bed of recruitment for Indian Army, right? So a lot of princes of Rajasthan, they used to recruit men, compel their men sent to fight in the World War. Okay, so as a result of all of that, the princes were rewarded. The princes were rewarded with what is called as the Chamber of Princes. So this was a consultative body that was set up in 1921, right? There, in the entire 1920s, in the third decade of the 20th century, that is 1920 onwards, you will find that the relationship between the princes and the English government actually slowly breaks down, right? And this breaking down of this equation between them has its reasons behind the federation principles of Government of India Act 1935. So once we start discussing in a while, you will get to understand the links, right? And many of the provisions of Government of India Act 1935 has a lot to do with the provisions of Nehru report. They have a lot to do with the objections of Jinnah's 14 points, plus the recommendations of Simon Commission. So it is, when you understand in what all ways these are all relevant, you will be able to figure out certain other provisions of Government of India Act 1935. All right, and not just that, we also have various factors such as the economic depression of the 1920s. The world goes into a state of economic depression after the First World War, right? A lot of capacities will be added during the course of the First World War, and all these capacities are now of no use because the demand is not going to be the same. So as a result of which, there is a slump in production, there is a slump in employment. The world gets into a recessionary period, but by 1929 the world enters into a phase of Great Depression, right? So economic depression of 1920s has its role in shaping the provisions of 1935 Act. All right, so it is a gamut of all these aspects which actually will make you understand 1935 Act better. So let's start addressing each one of them one by one. So firstly, we will take up the idea called as the idea of federation. The idea of federation is something that you will find in the Government of India Act 1935, right? So after all, you may know that, you may have from your own reading of Lakshmikant, you would know that the federation never came into existence. Do you know why? First of all, why was this idea of federation even brought into existence, right? Because questions can also be asked based on that. UPSC can give two statements, statement 1, statement 2. Statement 1 is federation did not come into existence, and statement 2 could be the causation behind that. It's only when you know if this was actually the cause or not, you will be able to get that such kind of questions right. All right, so first we need to understand what was this idea of federation, and why did it even was placed in the provisions of 1935 Act. Okay, for this, let's just have a brief glance into the relationship between the different princely states and the British government. You see, the Nizam of Hyderabad was none but a Subadar of the Mughal Emperor. He was an employee of the Mughal Emperor, and so were the different Nawabs, right? And all the different Hindu Rajput rulers, they have all accepted a vassal status under the Mughal Emperor. So the political condition of India when the revolt of 1857 took place, because it was in the revolt of 1857 when finally the Mughal Emperor is now overthrown. The Mughal monarchy was abolished, which means all the princely states from then onwards, all of them would come under the British government, right? Which means the British government is now the overlord. The British government is now the sovereign power, and all the different princes of India, all the native rulers are supposed to be their vassals of the British crown, right? So this was the equation that came to existence after the revolt of 1857, right? And this equation was an equation of unequals. You should not assume that all the princely states were on equal league as that of the British Emperor or the British Empress. No, that was not the case, right? The highest gun salute that was given to any particular prince in India was always kept lower than that of the Viceroy. And Viceroy, he is just a representative of the crown, so which means the crown is always at a superior position, and all Indian princes and rulers were all subordinates, they were all vassals. So there was no question of parity between them, and this relationship of unequals is what irritates the relationship between irritates the princes in the upcoming years, right? So for example, when Curzon was the Viceroy, Lord Curzon tried to regulate the movement of princes outside India. The princes were not allowed to travel outside India without getting the consent and permission of the Viceroy, right? And not only that, the bridge between the British government and the princely state, who was the intermediary between the two? There was a British resident who was posted in the court of the princely state. So he was like the bridge between the Viceroy and the princely state, right? And these British political residents who were placed in the princely states, they did really meddle with the internal affairs of the princes. Many of the princes were forced to undertake a lot of reforms which went against their autocratic rule. Popular assemblies were brought in. A very reform system of taxation was brought in. The expenditure of the princes were all controlled. Right? Many reforms in the domain of education, in the domains of untouchability. Right? So there was a certain element of a social intervention as well, which was all done by these British residents, which was all not to the liking of the princely states. So the relationship between the princes and the British government was not a very cordial one. There was always certain aspects of friction between them, and such aspects of friction used to be aggravated when you have viceroys like Curzon, who wanted to display the sovereign status of the British crown over the princes now and then. Right? So the princes were made to feel inferior. Right? But the policy was reversed under Lord Minto, who was a successor of Curzon. So what I am trying to say is, it was a hot and cold relationship that used to exist between the British government and the princely states. And many princes, they used to even make it symbolic. They used to wear gloves before they shake hands with the political resident. They will not shake hands without a glove, which means that the prince wanted to show, he wanted to display to the people that he is shaking hands with an inferior. Right? So there was a certain amount of a hot and cold relationship between the princes and the British government. Just because the princes had contributed to the war efforts, to the First World War efforts from 1914 to 18, the British government was happy with them, and a chamber of princes was set up. Right? But the events of non-cooperation movement had clearly given an eye-opener for the princes about what is the future. The princes were able to understand that the days of the British in India are numbered. It's a matter of time before Congress would take power completely in India. Right? So the princes had awakened to the possibility of a future Congress takeover of the Indian government. Now that scares the princes. So the princes, the native rulers, they all go to the Viceroy and they give a representation. And what is that representation? The princes would want the status, the relationship between the princes and the British government to be clearly clarified. Right? So what is the level of interference that the British government can do in princely states? That is one point that the princes would want to be clarified. And second point that the princes would want to be clarified is, if in the future Congress was to take over the government from British, in that case, will the princes automatically be considered to have acceded to the Indian Union, or will there be separate agreements and treaties that have to be made between each princely state and the future Indian government? Right? Because India during this time, it had two different dominions. One was you have the British India, and then you have the princely states. Right? So it was as a result of instruments of accession which was signed between the different princely states and the British government. That's the reason why the princely states have agreed to this level of sovereignty of the English government over them. But what would be the question in the future? If at all Congress governments were to take over, in that case, does it mean that the Congress will be the sovereign over the princely states as well? Right? Does it mean that the princely states are by default considered to have become a part of Indian Union? These are the two questions that the princely states actually wanted to be clarified. One is, what is the present level of paramountcy? What is the present level of interference that the British government can have into the internal affairs of the princes? Number one. Secondly, what is the future status of princely states when there is a complete Congress takeover of Indian Union? Right? So these are the two questions, and it is to settle these two questions, it is to answer these two questions, a committee was constituted under the chairmanship of a person who was called as Harcourt Butler. Right? So this was a committee that was actually formed in the year 1927, and the committee had given answers for these two questions. One is on the question of sovereignty. To what extent can the British government interfere with the internal affairs? The committee was very clear. The British can go to any lengths. It can just go for complete interference, subverting the internal autonomy of the princely rulers. That was the answer given by Harcourt Butler Committee, right? And the second question that was answered by the committee was whether, in the case of a future Congress takeover, do the princes have to sign separate instrument of accession with any future government? The committee said yes. The princes on their own cannot be forced to become a part of any future Indian Union. The princes have to individually sign what is called as instrument of accession, if at all in the future there would be an Indian Union. So this was the answer given by the Harcourt Butler Committee, right, regarding these two questions. But the answer given over matters of sovereignty, this actually alarmed the princes. The princes felt cheated. The princes felt, despite all the support that we gave to you during the course of the First World War, and when non-cooperation movement was going on, we were very, very supportive in suppressing all the rebels, because all the Congress leaders, they used to run away from British India. They used to go to princely states. All of them were arrested. They were all handed over to British authorities, right? So princely states, they felt cheated because of the answer given by the Harcourt Butler Committee, right? And this was the time when the princely states, they decide to become closer with Indian National Congress, and there is a reason for that. If you remember, the Congress political activism in the 1920s is different from its political activism in 1930s. In the 1920s, the Congress did actively discourage any nationalist movement in the princely states. The Congress did not support any kind of people's movements in the princely states. The Congress wanted to keep the princely states at an arm's length, because the Congress felt each princely state had different levels of political maturity. Whereas you take the British India as a whole, Madras, Bengal, Bombay, they have all reached similar levels of political maturity. So people have a certain level of political awareness, political education. So it's easy to mobilize the people in British India. But princely states, each state has very different levels of political awareness among the people. So that's why Congress did not support any of the people's movements in the states in the 1920s. Whereas this stance will actually change in the 1930s. We'll see that later, right? So just because INC was not in support of people's movement in the princely state in the 1920, this was the reason which brought the princes in a cordial relationship with Congress. And Congress in 1928 came up with Nehru Report, right? And Nehru Report was the first call given by Indians for an idea of federation comprising of British India plus princely states, right? And the princes were very welcoming of this idea. And what was the reason? They felt, if at all they would have a federal body at the center, right, and it is this federal body that is going to bring in reforms in the princely states, the princes felt they had a better chance of preventing those reforms from happening than being under the sovereign control of British government. So the princes were also very happy that the control of princely states would transfer from the hands of the Governor General. It will transfer into a federal body, into a federal assembly. The princes thought they'll be able to dominate the federal assembly. So that's why the princes were very welcoming of the idea of federation that was actually put forward in the Nehru Report, right? And an agreement was even reached between Congress and the princely states that was called as the Delhi Pact. A Delhi Pact, it was an agreement between the big princes of India as well as the Indian National Congress as to the acceptance of this idea of federation, right? Now what happens? So what is this idea of federation? Let's have a look at that. So to have a look at the idea of federation, you also have to remind yourself of the preamble of the Government of India Act 1919. Alright, so the last video discusses about it. What is the preamble of the Government of India Act 1919? It said that responsible government will be given to Indians, right? Responsible government, this shall be given to Indians, but this will be given in a progressive manner. It will not be given in a single sudden manner. It will be given in progressive, stage by stage manner, right? So responsible government was first to be tried in provinces. If it works well, now it will be implemented in the center, right? And even in the province, as per the Government of India Act 1919, it's not a case of complete responsible government being given. We had the idea called as diarchy, which was actually introduced, right? So holding true to the promise pledge given in the preamble of 1919, now what happens is this diarchy is now going to be implemented in the center. All right, so let's see the influence of this idea of federation and the provision of Government of India Act 1919 in how a federal setup is created in the center, right? So let's have a look at the central structure of both legislature as well as the executive. So let me just revise your memory once again of whatever we have discussed till this point. So the provisions of 1935 Act is as a result of influence of various factors, starting from Government of India Act 1935, the different constitutional proposals given by Nehru report, Jinnah's objections, recommendations made by Simon Commission, right? So, and the relationship that was becoming worse between princely states and the British government. So these are all the different factors which have influenced the provisions of 1935 Act, right? So we were discussing about the idea of why princely states have become okay with the idea of federation, right? I told you about Harcourt-Butler Committee, which wanted to clearly settle what was the relationship, the nature of relationship between princely states and British India, right? And the committee's answers were not satisfying to the princely states. They felt still alarmed. They felt that the British have an unlimited interfering powers into the internal autonomy of the princely states, right? So this was also the same time when Congress was not very supportive of people's movement in the princely states, right? So that's why the princes were able to warm up to the politics of Indian National Congress, and since the Nehru report had spoken about the idea of a federal body, and the princes found a relief in that federal body. The princes would rather prefer to place their sovereignty in the hands of this federal body, which they hoped they can still control, right? Instead of keeping the control of their autonomy into the hands of the British Governor General, because British Governor General cannot be tamed, cannot be controlled by the princes. Whereas this federal body, if that is going to decide reforms inside the princely states, the princes still felt they had a chance of controlling the federal body. That's why they were able to warm up to the politics of Congress. So they also welcomed the idea of federation. All right. So how was this idea of federation? How was this realized? Let's have a look at the central structure that was actually brought in. In the center, just like the Government of India Act 1919, just remember what we have discussed in the previous class. In the Government of India Act 1919, a bicameral legislature was introduced, right? The very same bicameral setup will continue, which means there will be a federal assembly, and then there will be what is called as the Council of States. So you need to actually understand the composition of this federal assembly. So just a map of India. So you have both British India and then you have princely states, right? So both these units will have representation in both federal assembly as well as in the Council of States. So in federal assembly, roughly around 30% of the seats will be reserved for princely states, whereas in the Council of States 40% of seats will be reserved for the princely states, right? And what about the remaining? So how are these members to these seats, how are they going to be filled? It is through a provision of nomination, right? So the respective princes, they will make nomination. Whoever they like, they will send as members to fill in these seats. Now what about the 70% of the seats in Federal Assembly? What about the 60% of the seats in Council of States? How are they going to be filled? They are going to be filled from British India. Please pay good attention to what I have to say now. From the British India, members to these 60% of the seats, right, they will be filled by indirect election. This is very similar to present day's Rajya Sabha's election. In Rajya Sabha, the members are chosen based on proportional representation by single transferable vote. And who are the electors? They are members of the state legislatures. Similarly, these 60% members are going to be elected indirectly by proportional representation method. And who are going to be the electors? Indirect election, and the electors are going to be provincial legislature members. Okay, why do I say this is important? This is a good point of difference between the Government of India Act 1919. If you remember in the previous lecture, the same bicameral setup that was created, where you had a federal assembly, you had a council of states, both the bodies were directly elected. The members from British India representing British India from federal assembly and in council of states, they will be directly elected, right? But when it comes to 1935 Act, when it comes to the representation in federal assembly, the members representing British India will be indirectly elected. So just assume 1935 Act is very opposite. It's the reverse of what exists today. In today's context, it is in Lok Sabha where we have direct election, in Rajya Sabha we have indirect election, whereas in 1935 in the federal assembly, right, we have indirect election, whereas in the council of states, which is very similar to Rajya Sabha, right, at least the name sounds similar, right. So here the remaining 60% of the seats, they are going to be directly elected. Of course, the property requirements to be an elector is very high. Only the richest cream of Indian society will even be able to elect members to council of states, right. So the princes, they thought, if the control, okay, let me give you an example. Let's say there is a princely state of Nizam of Hyderabad here, all right. If this was under the sovereignty of Viceroy, and now the Viceroy decides he wants to bring railways within Hyderabad, now the prince cannot do anything. He has to simply give land, he has to simply accept whatever the Viceroy says. But whereas now, if this legislature is going to decide whether railway lines should be set up in the Nizam's territory, the Nizam now has a hope. He feels that some way the bill will fail in either of the two houses, which means that the Nizam, nothing can be done against the wishes of the Nizam, right. So the Nizam would now feel, as a prince, he feels he has better control over his internal autonomy in this setup rather than keeping control in the hands of the Governor General, right. And that's the reason why the princes had initially supported this idea of federation. The idea of federation where both princely states as well as British India will be represented in both the houses of the central legislature, of the federal legislature, right. This is very similar to today's context, right. But whereas you make a comparison with Government of India Act 1919, in 1919 Act, you do not actually have any representation from the princely states in federal legislature, right. But whereas when it comes to in the central legislature, whereas this is called as a federal legislature, and in 1935 Act we do have representation from the princely states in these bodies, right. It's based on an equality of relationship between British India and the princely states. So princes felt they have better chance of protecting their internal autonomy from the transgression of the British Viceroy if they accept this setup, right. That's why the idea of federation was brought in, and this was the idea that was brought in the Government of India Act 1935. But later, what happened? I told you, in the 1920s, the Congress did not support people's movement in the states. But the stand of Congress completely changes in 1930s. When you read history books, you will come across a session of Congress which is called as the Haripura session of Congress, right. I think it's in 1936 or 37, I'm not sure about the exact year. It was in the Haripura session where Congress suddenly reverses its stand. It says that from now onwards, the objective of Congress is to help people in the states, in the princely states as well, realize their nationalist aspirations. Now the Congress from here onwards, it starts supporting people's movements, right, which actually is taken by the princes as a visible symbol of Congress betrayal. They feel that Congress cannot be trusted anymore, and that is the reason why the princes, the princely states, did not join this idea of this federation, and that is also the same reason why this setup at center never came into existence, because as per the Government of India Act 1935, it is only when 50% of Indian princes they accept this federal setup, only then this kind of a setup in the center will even come into existence. But the princes now, they have got alarmed, they have got scared because of Congress betrayal. They initially thought Congress would not meddle with their internal affairs, but now they feel the Congress is instigating revolt, protest in the princely states. So they decide not to join hands with Congress anymore, and that is the reason why 50% of the princes never accepted this federal idea, as a result of which this central setup never even came into operation. So which means that this idea of diarchy actually did not come into operation in the center. Then you may ask me a question, then what was the nature of central setup that continued till independence? It was the same setup that was created in the Government of India Act 1919. It was the setup of 1919 which actually continued till independence in 1947. The setup should have been replaced by this new setup of federation as per the 1935 Act, but since this did not come into existence, the same setup continued till the end, which means direct elections will be held to fill in members to central legislature, right? So this new setup did not come into existence. All right, so this is the kind of a setup that was created for central legislature. Now let's have a look at what was the setup that was created for the central executive. Let's have a look. Just remember the pledge of 1919 Act, Government of India Act 1919 preamble. What did it say? It said responsible government. First you will try it in the provinces and then you will implement it in the center, right? So which means diarchy is now brought in the center. So if diarchy is brought in the center, now more concessions should be given in the provinces, right? Because it was a successful model. Diarchy had worked well in the provinces. No wonder it's now experimented in the center. So in the level of province, you have to make further concessions, which means diarchy is now abolished in the provinces, and in the place of diarchy, you are bringing completely responsible government, where no subjects are now going to be held in the control of Governor General, right? Everything is going to be transferred to Indian hands. This is actually a higher level of autonomy is given to the provinces, whereas a somewhat decent level of autonomy is given in the center in the form of diarchy, right? So as per the Government of India Act of 1935, diarchy is created in the center, right? So what does it mean? It means first of all, we are creating a federal setup. When we create a federal setup, which means the entire subjects of legislation will be divided into three categories. One is unionist. See, today India, we have a federal setup, right? We have certain subjects on which center can make laws, certain subjects states can make laws, and then there are certain subjects where both center as well as states can make laws. A similar setup was brought in because we subscribe to the idea of federation in the Government of India Act 1935. A similar setup was brought in, wherein all the subjects of legislation were divided into a federal list, they were divided into a provincial list, and then there was a concurrent list. This was the way of how subjects were demarcated. All right. Now, when it comes to these federal subjects are now to be divided into two categories because of diarchy: reserved and transferred, right? So those who are not familiar with this may watch the previous lecture where I have clarified what is reserved, what is transferred subject, and all of that. So this, see, let's be very clear. The idea of federation means powers of legislation, powers of taxation have to be clearly earmarked between center and states, right? So that's why we have a clear list of subjects for central legislation, for provincial legislation. So among the subjects for federal legislation, now since diarchy is experimented, the subjects are divided into two categories: reserved as well as transferred, right? Now here comes an important difference. When it comes to transferred subjects, who is the head of central executive? See, we are discussing about central executive. Who is going to be the head of central executive? It's the Governor General or the Viceroy, right? And to assist this Governor General, when it comes to these transferred subjects, the Government of India Act 1935 provides for not less than 10 members. So these 10 members, they are Indians. It is these Indian members who are now the ministers for these transferred subjects, who will aid and advise the Governor General. So the Governor General, with the assistance of these 10 councillors, with the help of their aid and advice, the Governor General has to carry out these transferred subjects. All right. So when it comes to reserved subjects, this is where you have to pay good attention now. Listen to what I have to say clearly. When it comes to reserved subjects, again there are two differentiation that is created. One are subjects where Governor General completely acts on his own discretion, and I'll tell you what these subjects are. Then you have the other subjects where Governor General will listen to the aid and advice of 3 members. They are not Indians, they are British officials. The Governor General acts as per the aid and advice of 3 councillors, but if he wants, he can even reject their advice. Alright. So what is the position of Governor General as per the 1935 Act? Let's have a clarity on that. There are subjects where Governor General acts completely in his discretion, and then there are subjects where Governor General listens to the aid and advice of his 3 councillors, but the Governor General may even reject the advice given by these 3 councillors, right? And then there are subjects, these are actually transferred subjects, which are lesser important compared to the other 2 categories. These could be subjects like possibly income tax, right? Maybe education, maybe labor issues. So such kind of subjects would be under this category of transfer. It would be transferred to Indian hands. Let Indians manage those departments, right? In this category, the Governor General, he mostly acts in accordance with the aid and advice of the 10 ministers, right? So acts in accordance with the advice given. Alright. So what are the entities, what are the subjects where the Governor General exercises complete discretion? He need not even listen to anybody. It's his own complete volition, which are very essential for those subjects that are essential for defense of India, external affairs, foreign relations, communications, with respect to management of tribal areas. Alright. And another peculiar aspect is whether a particular subject is subject which would fit into this particular category, right? If there is a doubt on a particular matter, and if members they contradict the governor and they say this is a subject for which you have to listen and act in our advice, it is the ultimate discretion of the Governor General to decide whether the subject falls in which category of these 3, right? Whether a particular subject is one in which governor will act in his own discretion, or will he act in accordance with the aid and advice given. It's also a discretionary power of governor to decide on that, right? So these are some of the different discretion that is available to the Governor General as per the 1935 Act. And then there are subjects where he listens to his ministers, but he may choose whether to accept their advice or to just turn a blind eye to their advice given. And these are subjects which are called as the special responsibilities of the Governor General. What are these special responsibilities? It's about maintaining peace and tranquility in India, basically home affairs, maintaining internal law and order. So that's a function which the Governor General may even discard the advice given by his 3 officers, 3 councillors. Alright. So maintaining the financial credit stability of India. You can consider this similar to our financial emergency provisions, right? Even here, when it comes to how much of borrowing can be done by the different states, different provinces, in all those kind of matters, the governor has a special responsibility to take a final call. He may listen or he may not listen, right? But then there are subjects in which he simply acts in accordance with the aid and advice given by the Indian ministers. Alright. And so what would be the position of these Indian ministers? These Indian ministers are now made responsible to the legislature. Okay. See, we are discussing about a structure which has not even come into existence. It's only if the princely states, 50% of them would have accepted the structure, all of this would have even come into operation. But none of this actually came into operation. As a result of which the same structure of 1919 Act would continue till 1947, till we got independence. But these are the provisions, and last year UPSC actually asked this question. When it comes to defense and external affairs, the governor will act, the control of defense and external affairs is placed in the hands of the Federal Assembly. That was a question asked. The answer is wrong. It is completely in the hands of Governor General's discretion. Next year it could be something to do with other aspects, right? So just try to make sense of what it is. So since we are experimenting with the diarchy, in all those transferred matters, the Indian ministers, they are made answerable, they are made responsible to the legislature, right? So collectively they are all responsible to the legislature, individually they are all responsible to the Governor General. It's very similar to present day's setup. Collectively our present Narendra Modi ji's government is responsible to the Lok Sabha, but individually choosing a particular minister, throwing him out of the ministerial berth, all of that, individually they are responsible to the president, right? Same is the case. If the Governor General wants, he can he can just throw out a particular minister, bring in another new minister. But when it comes to the government as a whole, they are responsible to the legislature. Very similar to present day's setup, right? Just understand about this structure, which is very important. When it comes to transfer subjects, the control is in the hands of the Indian members, because the Indian members, they will aid and advise the Governor General, and the Governor General has to act in accordance with this advice given, right? But then there are two other categories as well, right? So what are the other powers of this Governor General when it comes to the legislative process? You should understand 80% of the federal budget is not votable. Only 20% of the items can even be voted by the legislature. 80%, because military was a big expenditure, railways was another expenditure, right? So all of those expenses cannot even be voted in the federal legislature. It was all completely in the discretion of the Governor General. So he will decide how much of money should be given to railways, how much should be given to military, to the maintenance of army. All right, and even when there is a provision, when there is a deadlock between the passage of bill between Federal Assembly and the Council of States, it's a Governor General who will call for a joint sitting. So this is again very similar to today's present position, where the President summons a joint sitting. Similarly, Governor General can call for a joint sitting of both the houses. And even though a bill can be passed by both Federal Assembly and the Council of States, and when the bill is now sent to the Governor General, he has a right to withhold his assent. Very similar to present day situation. But today the President has to be guided by the Council of Ministers. But back then, Governor's discretion. Withholding his assent or giving his assent, complete another area where Governor General exercises his discretion. Alright. So this is all about the structure of the central legislature as well as the central executive. Now let's move on to the level of provinces. Let's see what was the condition in provinces. So now when it comes to the provinces, let's look at the structure in the provincial level. First, provincial legislature. So what is the scheme of representation that you find here in provincial legislature? First of all, just try to recollect the provisions of Nehru report and why was it opposed by Jinnah in his 14 points. Jinnah wanted a separate province status for Sindh. He did not like Sindh being a part of Bombay, right? He felt if only Sindh would have its own provincial assembly, then Muslims would have a fairly higher chance of getting bills favorable to them passed in the house. So Jinnah wanted immediately a creation of a new province of Sindh, but Nehru report did not accept that. Motilal Nehru, he insisted that yes, we also require a separate Sindh as a separate province, but this should be after India gets dominion status. But Jinnah couldn't wait for that, right? A similar provision you will be finding it in the Government of India Act 1935, because Jinnah was also invited as a part of round table conference. So he had been there, he had put forward his opinion, and that was factored in by the Britishers. That's why Government of India Act 1935, it creates a separate province of Sindh as well as Orissa. So two new provinces were created as per the Government of India Act 1935. Alright, and now when it comes to certain other provinces, let's say the old provinces of Madras, of Bengal, of Bombay, and central provinces, united provinces. So for all these provinces, now Britishers are creating a bicameral setup, right? So this is something that you will have to again correlate with the provisions of Government of India Act 1919. In the Government of India Act 1919, and as per the last video lecture, I would have told you why bicameralism was introduced in this level of center. Why was it created? So as to have this Council of States as a check and balance for the Central Legislative Assembly. They wanted the second house to be a check, because the second house will be populated with very conservative sections of the society. You will have landlords, you will have zamindars. They wouldn't like radical sweeping laws to be brought in by the first house. So the British expected that the second house will play a role of a spoiler when it comes to the laws passed by the first house. This is with respect to the Government of India Act 1919. Similar logic is why a bicameral setup will be created in these provinces. Right? These are the provinces where Congress was the strongest. Right? So that is the reason why Britishers wanted to create a bicameral setup. So there could be a question asked tomorrow in your prelims. The question would be, bicameralism was introduced in all the provinces. The answer is no. Because Sindh, Orissa, Punjab, Northwest Frontier province, they did not have a bicameral setup. It was only in those areas where Congress politics was at its strongest, peasant movements were at its strongest. It is there where it was expected that a second chamber, which was actually drawn from the landholding classes, drawn from Europeans, drawn from commercial classes, they would be a very good bulwark. They would be a very good check and balance against the popular politics. Right? So that was the reason why in certain provinces a bicameral setup was created. Let's be clear about it. Bicameralism was not in all provinces, but in a few of these provinces. Alright. The reason is because now at the level of provinces, I have already told you, complete responsible government is now going to be given, which means that the governor from now onwards will act as per the aid and advice of his Council of Ministers. Of course, there will be areas of discretion. Right, when it comes to giving assent to a bill passed by the state legislature, governor has his discretion. Just like how 80% of the federal budget was in the discretion of the Governor General, similarly 40% of provincial budgets, they were all not votable in the House, which means they are in the discretion of the Governor. And the Governor will exercise his discretion when it comes to reserving the bills for the consideration of the Governor General. Right, in all those matters, governors exercised complete discretion. And not only that, when it comes to suspension of these governments, right, very similar to today's state emergency provisions, where governors today can dismiss state governments. Similar provisions existed in section 93, I think, of the Government of India Act 1935, where the governors, on their own discretion, they can actually suspend the operation of the elected governments, and many governors did exercise their powers as well. Right? So these are the functions where the governors will act in his discretion, but otherwise, since it's a responsible government at the level of provinces, you will find Indian ministers aiding and advising the governors in their functions. Alright, and these Indian ministers now, they are all made responsible to the provincial legislature, which means a no confidence motion can be introduced in the provincial legislature and the entire ministry can be thrown out. And there were occasions when in Punjab as well as in Bengal, the coalition ministries that was formed by the Krishak Praja Party in Bengal and by the Unionist Party in Punjab, they had the support of Muslim League. So it was all coalition governments that were initially formed. Right? So those coalition governments were all toppled because of no confidence motions. Right? So what I am trying to say is that a very responsible form of government had come into existence at the level of provinces because of these provisions. Alright. So this is all you need to actually know. And now when it comes to representation, who were the members who were represented in the provincial legislature? That is another important part to be discussed. Right. So when it comes to provincial legislatures, apart from general constituency, where anybody, if you meet certain property requirements, you can contest elections. In addition to the general constituencies, you also had separate constituencies, you also had reserved seats, right? Seats were reserved for whom? Seats were reserved for scheduled castes. So I don't want to go too deep into the history of this. You know about the first a communal award was given by the British Prime Minister where separate electorates were reserved for scheduled castes. Then Mahatma Gandhi, he went on a fast unto death. Later he was convinced by other leaders to give up on his fast, and in return the separate electorates for SCs was done away with. Instead, seats were reserved for scheduled caste members in the provincial assembly, right? So at least some good has come for scheduled caste members in the provincial levels. But when it comes to separate electorates, just think about, when was the idea of separate electorates introduced for the first time? In the Government of India Act 1919, it was given for Muslims. Later, this was in 1990. Then in 1935, 1909, and in 1919 Act, this was extended further to Sikhs. It was extended to industrialists. I have already discussed the reasons for that in the previous lecture. And now, as per the 1935 Act, 2 more sections were also added to this, right? One, women, other was labor. Why was labor given separate electorates? Because communist ideas were spreading in the country. Various trials were filed in different courts, and these were trials against communist conspiracy to overthrow the state. So the government was becoming a bit concerned about labor, right? In fact, the biggest menace, the biggest headache for Britishers in civil disobedience movement was the labor force. So there was a general anger in the minds of labor. So Britishers wanted to pacify that anger. That's why labor was given representation in the provinces by giving a separate electorate for them. And Simon Commission had made note of women political associations coming up in India in the 1920s. And Simon Commission had also noticed that for women literacy, for women better healthcare for women, for all of that to improve, there should be women's representatives in the houses, because the houses were all just masculine, right? There were simply just no women at all. So that's when the Simon Commission had made a strong recommendation for inclusion of women into legislatures, and that's the reason why separate electorates for women was also given, right? So this is how the idea of separate electorates was further it was utilized to give representation for both women and labor, whereas when it comes to scheduled castes, it was not separate electorates, it was reserved seats, right? Basically the difference is that members who contest elections to reserved seats, let's say this is a constituency and a member of scheduled caste, this is reserved. So it means that only a SC person can contest elections. But when he contests elections, members from both general as well as SC community, all of them will vote in this election. Whereas when it comes to separate electorates, let's say if this is a constituency, and let's say member representing labor contests election, only those who are registered as workers, they alone can vote, right? This is the difference between separate electorates and reserved seats. Alright, so understand, at the level of provincial legislatures, reservations were made for scheduled castes, seats were earmarked as separate electorates for both women and labor. So this is in addition to the Sikh industrialists as well as the Muslims. All of these categories were all given separate electorates. Alright, so these are all the different provisions with respect to the representation at the provincial level. Alright, now there are just a few more areas to discuss about the Government of India Act 1935, right? So when you read Lakshmikant, there is a provision. It says that RBI was introduced for the first time. Alright, why was it even introduced for the first time? It's also linked with another topic, which is another point of Government of India Act 1935, which is given in your Lakshmikant, that is a Council of India, this body which existed in Britain, this will be abolished. And both these have very similar reasons. Alright, basically I'll just give you an example. In the entire 1920s, Indian industrialists were having a very difficult time, right? One is the demand itself is lesser, and the other reason is because Japanese textiles from Japan had hit Indian markets, and these textiles were very cheap, They were cheaply produced compared to Bombay manufactured Indian textiles, which means that Indian textiles are going to suffer even badly, right? So what is the ideal way out? The Governor General should have imposed tariffs on the Japanese textiles, but this did not happen. All right. The reason is because this Council of India from Britain, it will exercise an influence on the Secretary of State so as to persuade the Governor General to not impose tariffs, because these members of Council of India, they were more concerned about the British Japanese friendship rather than being concerned about Indian manufacturers, right? So that is why there was a very strong element of protest from Indian industrialists. In the last video I have discussed, during the time of World War 1914 to 18, it was the capitalists, it was the industrialists who benefited the most out of the World War. But the same industrialists in the 20s, if you see, they'll become die-hard enemies of the British Raj, right? So the Britishers would want to pacify these industrialists. The Britishers want to give a clear statement that this body, Council of India, which is perceived to be against the Indian interests, no longer exists. That is why Council of India will be abolished. And this is a body which was set up after the revolt of 1857. This was a body set up to assist the Secretary of State in his functions. And who will be the members of Council of India? Former Governor Generals, former ICS officers who would now want some post-retirement option. They'll all be members of Council of India, right? So this body is now going to be abolished. And not only that, the power to fix exchange rate, between Indian rupees and between the pound sterling, the British pound, right? This used to be fixed in Britain. Okay, it was Britain which used to fix this exchange rate, and they used to fix the exchange rate whichever was in ways convenient for them. All right, but now because of the industrialists becoming die-hard enemies of British government in the 1920s, it was once again now decided, okay, let us give this power in the hands of Governor General. Let Governor General decide what should be the exchange rate between the Indian rupee and the pound sterling. But the Governor General has no idea about economics, he has no idea about money supply, and that's the reason to advise the Governor General. That's why we have a body called Reserve Bank of India, which was actually set up. So this was a body set up to decide on exchange rates. Okay, monetary policy, just like how it does today. But today exchange rate is decided because of market forces of demand and supply. But back then, what should be the exchange rate between rupee and pound should be decided by the Governor General, and to assist him, that is why Reserve Bank of India was created, right? So these are the reasons why these measures were also made as a part of Government of India Act 1935. Abolition of Council of India because it was perceived to always take on an anti-India line. Next is creation of RBI to decide on monetary exchange rates. Okay, and in addition to that, now that a federal setup is proposed, right, there will always be dispute between provinces and the center about who can make laws on what matters. Is this a central domain of legislation or a provincial domain of legislation? So you need dispute resolution mechanism, and the dispute resolution mechanism was set up in the form of a federal court, right? So which is today's Supreme Court, right? Today's Supreme Court has its important jurisdiction of federal jurisdiction. That is, if there is a conflict between center and states, the only court to have an exclusive jurisdiction to resolve the conflict would be the Supreme Court, right? Similarly, a federal court was set up to adjudicate disputes between provinces and center, right? So these are all the different important points that you have to remember out of Government of India Act 1935, right? Here we have 3 points regarding federal court, regarding RBI, regarding a separate council, the abolition of Council of India, and in the previous slide you have the different representation in the provincial level and for what all sections, right? You have separate electorates, you have reserved seats, and in the previous slide you have the bicameral setup that was created in different provinces, not for all provinces but for certain provinces, right? Sindh and Orissa created as separate provinces. right, and complete responsible government, which was implemented at the level of provinces, which means the Indian ministers dealing with the transferred subjects, now they are going to be completely answerable, responsible to the legislature. All right. And moving backwards, so this is a slide where we have the different powers and the scope of discretion that the Governor General can exercise. In what all matters he can be completely guided by his discretion. These are the 4-5 matters. Then there are subjects where he listens to the ministers, but he is not bound to act in their advice. Those are his special responsibilities. And then there are functions of Governor General where he acts in accordance with the Council of Ministers advice, and this is the diarchical setup. So hence we have transferred subjects being earmarked, and it is in the exercise of these functions where the Indian ministers are now made responsible to the legislature. A limited form of responsible government being brought in the level of center, right? And the Governor General has certain discretion in deciding 80% of the expenditure is completely under his control, in deciding to whether to give assent to bills or not, and to decide on whether a joint sitting of the houses should be summoned or not. In all these cases the Governor General exercises his discretion, right? And before that we have discussed about the idea of federation, the composition of both these houses, the methodology of elections to be followed to both these houses, right? And one additional point that we have discussed is also the idea of Harcourt Butler Committee, right? So this is a committee appointed so as to set right the question of paramountcy between British government and the princely states. To what extent can the British government interfere in the affairs? And these were the answers given. All right. So this is all. This is mostly every aspect governing Government of India Act 1935. So I hope now you are more confident, and all that you need to do right now is go take your Lakshmikant and Spectrum in the light of whatever discussions we have had. Now just finish reading it. I am very sure you will be able to really master what you actually feared once. All right. So thank you.